She was 18 years old, had a busted leg that never healed right, and hadn't eaten a full meal in 3 days. And her own father sold her for $2, not out of desperation, not out of grief, out of spite, and a thirst for whiskey that had long since swallowed whatever was left of the man he used to be. Eliza Rowan didn't scream when they came for her. She didn't beg. She stood in the doorway of that rotting cabin and looked her father dead in the eyes, and he couldn't hold her gaze. That was the only victory she had that night, but she held on to it like a blade. If you've ever wondered what it takes to survive when the one person who is supposed to protect you becomes the one who destroys you, stay with me. This is Eliza's story. Watch until the end. Hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The Rowan cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that the county had never bothered to name. It was the kind of place that looked like it had given up trying. The porch sagged on one side. The chimney had shed half its mortar, and the window on the eastern wall had been covered with oilcloth for so long that nobody remembered what it had looked like with glass. 3 acres of thin soil stretched out behind it, barely enough to grow corn, never enough to sell any. The creek that ran along the property line had a tendency to flood in spring and go completely dry by August, which meant it was useless for almost everything. A person driving past on the main road, assuming they ever had reason to be on that road, might glance at the cabin and think, somebody lives hard out here. They would have been right. Eliza Rowan had lived hard her entire life. She was 18 years old that autumn, though she moved like someone who had already been through more seasons than her age suggested. Her hair was dark brown, thick, and perpetually tied back because she didn't have time for it to be anything else. Her hands were rough. Her eyes were the color of creek water in late October, not quite gray, not quite green, something in between that shifted depending on the light and her mood. She was not a tall woman, but she carried herself as though she intended to occupy whatever space she was in, which was something her mother had taught her before the consumption took her 3 winters ago. The leg had been broken when she was 14, a stupid accident involving a loose plank on the barn loft and a moment of not paying attention. It had been set wrong, or maybe not set properly at all, because the nearest doctor was 12 miles away and cost money they didn't have. So it healed the way it wanted to heal, which was crooked and slightly short, and ever since then she'd walked with a hitch on the left side that was most visible when she was tired. She'd learned to push through it. She'd learned to push through most things. Her father, Edmund Rowan, had not learned to push through anything. He'd been a capable man once, or at least people in town said he had been. She had no real memory of that version of him. What she knew was the version that had arrived sometime around her 12th birthday, roughly when the drinking became less of an evening habit and more of a full-time occupation. He was a big man going soft, with hands that had forgotten how to do the work they were built for, and a voice that had grown louder in inverse proportion to his usefulness. He still went into Caldwell Creek about once a week, ostensibly for supplies. Mostly he came back smelling like the inside of a barrel and carrying less than he'd left with. They had a younger brother, Thomas, who was 11, and Eliza had quietly assumed the management of his existence years ago. She made sure he ate. She made sure he went to the schoolhouse when the weather allowed. She mended his clothes and checked his arithmetic and kept him out of their father's way on the bad nights, which were most nights. It was a Tuesday in October when everything changed. She remembered the day specifically because she'd killed a rabbit that morning, actually caught it in a snare she'd set herself, which didn't always work, and had made a thin stew from it that she was quietly proud of. Thomas had eaten 2 bowls. She'd eaten one and told him there wasn't enough for a second serving, which was a lie. But she'd learned early that growing boys ate more than they admitted, and an 11-year-old's stomach mattered more than her own. She was banking the fire for the night when she heard her father come in. She knew immediately something was different. Not the usual heavy-footed stumbling. These were deliberate steps, careful ones, the way a man walks when he's trying not to be noticed doing something he knows is wrong. She stayed where she was, crouched near the hearth, and listened. 2 sets of footsteps. She turned. Edmund Rowan was standing in the doorway with a man she had never seen before. He was shorter than her father, dressed in a dark coat that was too fine for the mountains, with a hat pulled low and a face that had a quality she couldn't immediately name. It took her a moment to find the word for it. Smooth. His face was too smooth in the way that certain things are too smooth, the kind of smooth that comes from practice, from years of arranging your features into something that reveals nothing. His name, she would later learn, was Corbin Hale, but she didn't know that yet. In that moment, she just knew she didn't like the way he was looking at her. Not at the room, not at her father, at her, like she was something he was considering purchasing. Eliza! Her father's voice had a strange quality to it, forced evenness. This here is a business associate of mine. Got some things to discuss. It's late, she said. She straightened up from the fire, and she was aware, she was always aware, of the hitch in her left leg as she did it. Thomas is asleep. Don't concern yourself with Thomas. Something cold moved through her chest. She looked from her father to the man in the coat and back again. What kind of business? The kind that don't concern you to ask about. Edmund crossed to the table and sat down heavily. He didn't look at her directly. That was when she knew, not what, not yet, but something. Because Edmund Rowan had done a great many things in her lifetime, some of them cruel, most of them foolish, but he had almost never been unable to meet her eyes. He was a man of bluster and volume, not subtlety. The fact that he was avoiding her gaze meant he had already done whatever this was, and he was only now telling her, "Sir?" The man in his coat, Hale, had a voice like a man who sold things for a living, practiced pleasantness. I run a successful establishment in Caldwell Creek, a house of accommodation. I'm looking for industrious young women to know. Eliza said it before he finished the sentence. She said it flatly, not with anger, the way you'd say no to a child who asked if they could put their hand in a fire. Whatever you're selling or whatever you think you're buying, the answer is no. You need to leave. Hale smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. Your father and I have already come to an agreement. She turned to look at Edmund. He was staring at the table. Papa? Her voice dropped. Not softer, quieter, which was different. Look at me. He didn't. Papa, look at me. Slowly Edmund Rowan raised his eyes to his daughter's face, and she saw it there. Not remorse exactly, but something adjacent to it. Something that in a better man might have grown into remorse if it had been given enough time and water. But he was not a better man. He was the man he was, which was a man who had looked at his eldest child and found in her a solution to a debt she had never known he owed. $2, he said, and his voice was almost apologetic. We needed the $2, Eliza. The silence that followed was the loudest thing she'd ever heard. She stood very still. The fire crackled behind her. Outside, a wind was moving through the ridge pines, making that sound like breathing that she'd fallen asleep to her entire life. Somewhere in the back room, Thomas stirred in his sleep and went quiet again. $2. She had made $2 last spring, hauling laundry for Mrs. Fenwick down in the creek settlement. She had made $2 once by gathering and selling medicinal bark to the apothecary in town. $2 was a week of exhausting work. $2 was a small sack of cornmeal and a length of good wool fabric and maybe a little left over. $2 was what her father thought she was worth. She looked at Corbin Hale and she said very calmly, "Get out of my house." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite irritation, amusement maybe, at the idea that the girl he'd just purchased had an opinion. "Miss Rowan, your father has accepted my terms. I have a paper here. I don't care about your paper." She moved toward the door, and the leg slowed her slightly, but not enough to matter because what was in her face apparently communicated something that made Hale take a small step backward despite himself. "I am not a piece of property. You cannot buy a person. And whatever my father told you, whatever that paper says, it has nothing to do with me. Leave." Hale straightened. The pleasantness dropped off his face like a mask. What was underneath it was harder. "Miss, I've done this many times. I understand you're distressed, but the fact, Eliza said, is that you're standing in my doorway uninvited, claiming to have bought a human being, and I'm telling you to get out." Edmund slammed his hand on the table. "Eliza, enough! You think I want this? You think this was my first choice? We are 3 months behind on the note for this land. 3 months. That's not $2. That's $30 we don't have. And if we lose this place, we're out on the mountain with nothing. You could have told me." Her voice didn't shake. She was proud of that later, thinking back. It didn't shake once. "You could have come to me and told me we were losing the land. We would have figured something out. We always figure something out. But you didn't come to me. You went to him. Edmund looked away again. Because you knew I'd say no, she said, and you did it anyway. Hale had moved slightly during this exchange, a deliberate repositioning that put him between Eliza and the door. She noticed. She filed it away. 2 men are waiting outside, he said. His voice had gone flat and businesslike. We'll give you a few minutes to collect what you need, whatever you can carry. A pause. I run a clean establishment, Miss Rowan. You'll be housed and fed and treated decently, provided you cooperate. I give you my word on that. She looked at him for a long moment. Your word, she said. Yes. That's all that's being offered to me. Your word. He spread his hands as though this were a reasonable situation. She turned back to look at her father one more time. He had his face in his hands now. She could see his shoulders shaking slightly, which she thought might be crying, except she could also smell the whiskey on him from across the room, and she'd learned years ago that Edmund Rowan's most dramatic gestures of emotion tended to happen when he was drunk enough to give himself permission to feel things. She thought about Thomas asleep in the back room, 11 years old. He still sometimes woke from nightmares and called for their mother. She thought about the rabbit stew going cold on the stove. She thought, if I run, they'll catch me. The leg won't let me run fast enough, and there are 2 men outside, and the nearest help is miles away and it's nearly dark. And she thought, if I cause enough of a scene right now, Thomas wakes up. And he does not need to see this. So she straightened her spine and she turned to the corner where her work coat hung on the nail, and she put it on, and she took the small cloth bag she used for market days, and she put into it the 3 things she would not leave without. Her mother's pewter thimble, which was the only thing of her mother's she still had, a small bone-handled knife that fit in her coat pocket, and a folded piece of paper on which she'd written down the mathematics of their debts and expenses. Not because it would help her tonight, but because carrying it felt like keeping something of herself intact. She walked past her father without speaking. At the door, she stopped. She turned back and she said, and her voice was very quiet, so it wouldn't carry to the back room. When Thomas wakes up in the morning and asks where I am, you tell him I went to find work, and you tell him I'll be back. Edmund's face worked. Eliza, tell him that. She walked out into the October night. Caldwell Creek was a town of about 400 people that sat in the crook of a valley between 2 ridges, like something that had fallen and hadn't bothered to get back up. It had a mill, 2 general stores, a tavern, a church, a blacksmith, a small post office, and, on a street that ran behind the mill where the decent families didn't like to think about, an establishment that called itself the Guthrie House. It had been there for 11 years. It had a painted sign with a rose on it that had faded to the color of dried blood. The windows on the upper floor were always lit yellow at night. Everyone in town knew what it was, and almost everyone in town had decided that knowing and doing something about it were 2 very different things, and that the first was uncomfortable enough without taking on the second. Corbin Hale owned it. He also owned 3 other establishments in 2 other counties, a fact that most people in Caldwell Creek didn't know, because Hale was very good at making things look smaller and more local than they were. Eliza arrived there on a Tuesday night in October, seated in the back of a wagon between 2 men she didn't know, with her cloth bag in her lap and the bone-handled knife pressing against her hip through her coat pocket. She had not spoken during the journey. Neither had the men. One of them was large and smelled of tobacco. The other was younger, maybe 20, and he'd had the decency at least to look uncomfortable about the whole thing, which she noted without giving him any credit for. The wagon stopped at the side entrance. Hale climbed down first and unlocked the door. Inside was a narrow hallway that smelled of lamp oil and something floral that wasn't quite covering something else underneath it. The floorboards were painted dark. The walls were papered in a pattern she couldn't make out in the dim light. A woman appeared from a door at the end of the hall. She was perhaps 40, though she looked older. She had the kind of face that had been pretty once and was still striking in a way that had more to do with bone structure than softness. Her hair was up. Her dress was dark. She looked at Eliza the way a person looks at a piece of furniture they've been asked to find a place for. "This is Marta," Hale said. "She manages the day-to-day. Whatever she tells you is what I'd be telling you myself." Marta studied Eliza for a moment. Her eyes went to the leg, the way Eliza was standing, the slight unevenness of her posture. "What happened there?" Marta asked. Broke it when I was 14, Eliza said. Set wrong. Does it stop you working? No, Eliza said. And then, because she couldn't help it. But what I'll be working at is not what you're thinking. Marta's expression didn't change. She looked at Hale. Hale smiled the smile again. The one that didn't mean anything. Give her a night to settle. We'll talk terms tomorrow. He said it the way a reasonable man says a reasonable thing, and then he left, and Marta led Eliza down the hall and up a set of stairs to a room on the second floor. It was not a large room, but it was cleaner than she'd expected. A narrow bed, a washstand, a window that looked out on the alley behind the building, a hook on the wall for clothes, a candle in a tin holder on the windowsill. There are 4 other girls, Marta said, standing in the doorway. You'll meet them in the morning. Meals are at 7, 12, and 6. You're not to leave the building without one of the men unless Mr. Hale gives permission, and you're not to— I'm not staying, Eliza said. She sat down on the edge of the bed, not because she was surrendering, but because her leg hurt, and she needed to be honest with herself about that. I want you to understand that from the start. I'm not going to pretend this is a situation I'm accepting. Marta was quiet for a moment. Every girl that's come through here said something like that, she said finally. Not cruel, just matter of fact. I'm sure they did, Eliza said. And I'm sorry for them, but I'm telling you anyway. Marta left without another word and closed the door. There was a sound on the other side. A lock or a latch. She couldn't be sure which. Eliza sat in the near dark with her cloth bag in her lap and the candle throwing shadows on the wall, and she did, for a few minutes, allow herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. Not panic. She was past the age where panic helped, but the simple, solid weight of it. Her father had sold her. She was in a locked room above a brothel in town. Thomas was home alone, and when he woke up in the morning, he would ask where she was, and their father would either tell him the truth or lie, and neither option was good. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs. Think, she told herself. Just think. She went through her inventory methodically, the way she went through the cabin's supplies at the end of each month. What did she have? The knife, the thimble, the paper, the coat on her back and the clothes she was wearing and the boots that were 2 winters old but still holding. She had what was in her head. And what was in her head included 11 years of managing a household on almost nothing, keeping track of debts and resources, solving problems that didn't have obvious solutions. She decided, quite a lot. The window was worth examining. She crossed to it, careful with her leg on the unfamiliar floor, and looked out. The alley below was perhaps 15 feet down. Stone and mud. No soft landing. A drain pipe ran along the outside wall, but it was old and she wasn't confident in her weight against it. And more importantly, she didn't know the town well enough to know where she'd go if she reached the alley successfully. Hale had said 2 men were outside earlier. She didn't know if they were still there or if there were others. Not tonight, then. Not without more information. She went back to the bed and sat down and thought for a long time. Morning came slowly, gray and cold, with frost on the inside of the window glass. Eliza heard movement in the hall before anyone knocked. Footsteps, voices, the sound of water being poured. She was already awake, had been for an hour, lying on top of the covers in her clothes with the knife in her coat pocket. Marta unlocked the door at what Eliza guessed was close to 7. Breakfast, she said. Downstairs was a kitchen that was larger than the narrow hall had suggested. 4 women were already seated around a table, in various states of wakefulness. Eliza took them in quickly, the way she'd learned to take things in. Not staring, just looking, the way you look at a new piece of terrain you need to understand. The oldest was perhaps 35. Her name, Eliza would learn, was Cora, and she had come from somewhere in Ohio, and she'd been at the Guthrie house for 3 years, which was the longest of anyone. She had a kind face that had gone cautious around the edges, the way kind faces do when they've had to learn to be careful. Next to her was a girl named Pearl, who might have been 20 and was from the eastern part of the state. She kept her eyes down at the table. There was a woman named Dee who was mixed race and had a scar on her chin she'd gotten, Eliza would learn later, from a man who'd decided she'd looked at him wrong. She was the most visibly guarded of the 4, watchful in a way that wasn't hostile so much as careful. And there was a girl who couldn't have been more than 16 and whose name turned out to be Lucy, which was also the name of the barn cat Eliza had when she was small, And that coincidence made something ache in her chest in a way she didn't have time for. Marta ladled out a thin porridge and set a plate of cornbread on the table, and then sat at the end like a schoolteacher watching a class. Eliza ate without speaking. She was hungry, and she wasn't going to pretend otherwise. "You're new," Cora said. She wasn't being unfriendly, just identifying a fact. "Came in last night," Eliza said. "Where from?" "Up the ridge. My father's place." Something moved through the table, a kind of silent recognition. Cora looked at Dee. Dee looked at her porridge. "How much did he get?" Dee said. Her voice was flat. Eliza put down her spoon. $2. The silence had a particular texture to it. Lucy, the 16-year-old, made a small sound that might have been a laugh, or might have been the other thing. "How much for you?" Eliza asked, and she asked it directly, because she felt like these women deserved directness. $5, Cora said. $3, said Pearl, without looking up. Dee said nothing. "I was taken," Lucy said quietly. "Not bought." And something in the way she said it settled the conversation into a different place, a quieter and heavier one. Eliza looked around the table. 4 women. Different origins, different arrivals, different faces, but all of them in this kitchen eating thin porridge in the yellow light. And all of them here because someone with more power had decided they should be. She felt a cold and particular fury move through her. Not hot, not explosive. Cold. The way water goes cold before it freezes. The kind of cold that takes a long time to thaw out and does a great deal of damage while it waits. "What happens if you try to leave?" she said. Cora looked at Marta at the end of the table. Marta was watching her porridge. "Hale has 2 men on the building at night," Cora said carefully. 3, sometimes, on weekends. Big Frank handles the back. There's also," she paused, choosing words, "there's a man he uses for problems. Name of Kelsey. You don't want to meet Kelsey." "Have you met him?" Eliza asked. A pause. "Pearl has," Cora said. Eliza looked at Pearl, who didn't look up. She said nothing more on the subject. She finished her porridge, and she looked around the room, and she thought about the layout of the building, what she'd seen coming in, what she could see from the window, what she'd heard through the night. She was building a map in her head. Hale arrived mid-morning with the same smooth-faced pleasantness he'd carried the night before, dressed even more carefully in daylight, pressed coat, clean boots, hat in hand when he came into the parlor where Marta had installed Eliza to wait. The parlor was the part of the house that was meant to look legitimate. Comfortable chairs, a cold fireplace, a bookshelf with actual books on it, which surprised her. She'd been examining the titles when Hale came in. "Didn't take you for a reader," he said. "Didn't take you for a man who kept books," she said. He smiled. He gestured for her to sit. She didn't. "Miss Rowan, I understand last night was distressing. That's natural. Change is always distressing at first." "What I find distressing," she said, "is being sold by my father and transported to a building I can't leave. The word change seems like it's doing too much work there." He tilted his head, acknowledging a point while not conceding anything. "Here's what I can offer you," he said. "You work here. You cooperate. Inside of a year, maybe less if you're sensible about it, you'll have enough set aside to—" "You're describing a debt I didn't agree to for a service I didn't consent to provide, and calling it an opportunity," she said. "I've done enough household accounting to know how those numbers work. The cost of my room, my food, my clothes, it all comes off whatever you tell me I've earned, doesn't it? So the debt doesn't actually shrink, or it shrinks very slowly on a timeline you control." Hale's pleasantness shifted slightly. Not much, but she caught it. "You're smart," he said. "Yes," she said. "I am, and I need you to hear me clearly when I tell you that I will not be doing what you're planning to use me for. Not tonight, not ever. You can lock the door. You can put your men outside. That doesn't change what I'm willing to do." He studied her for a moment. Then he pulled a chair around and sat down in it backward, resting his arms on the top of it, and looked at her with the look of a man who is recalculating something. "Here's the thing about willingness," he said, and his voice had dropped the pleasantness now, or most of it. "In my experience, it's more flexible than people expect. Not because I do anything dramatic to change it, just because of time. Time and circumstances tend to I don't need a speech about how I'll eventually break, Eliza said. Maybe I will. But you spent $2 on me, and I'm going to cost you considerably more than that in trouble before you see any return, and I think you already know that. He looked at her for a long moment. Marta tells me you were talking to the girls at breakfast, he said. We had breakfast together, she said. People talk at breakfast. I prefer you didn't spend a lot of time talking to the girls. I'm sure you would. He stood up. The pleasantness came back like a door being closed. You'll stay in your room today. We'll talk again tomorrow. She turned away from him and back to the bookshelf. She heard him stop at the doorway. Miss Rowan, I want this to go well for you. I genuinely do. She pulled a book off the shelf, didn't even look at what it was, and opened it and didn't respond. He left. She stood there with the book open in her hands, not reading, just breathing, and she let herself acknowledge for the first time since the night before that she was afraid. Not of what he said he wanted, not even of Kelsey, whoever that was. She was afraid of the particular mathematics of her situation, that she was right that she'd caused trouble, but that causing trouble in a locked building far from everything she knew had its own costs, and she didn't know yet if she was able to pay them. One day at a time, she thought. Her mother had said that once, when the money was worst and the food was lowest and the winter had its jaws into the ridge and showed no sign of letting go. Just get through the day you're in. She put the book back on the shelf. She went upstairs to her room, and she looked at the window in the alley below, and she started thinking harder. The chance came 3 days later, and it didn't come as a plan. It came as an accident that she turned into something else. She'd been moved from complete room restriction to being allowed in the downstairs hall and kitchen during the day, which suggested Hale was trying a different tactic, normalizing her circumstances, making the building feel less like a cage if she started treating it like a home. She understood the logic. She didn't let herself be swayed by it, but she understood it. Marta sent her out back on the third afternoon to bring in a load of wood from the pile in the alley. One of the big men, not Big Frank, the other one, whose name she'd learned was Garrett, was standing at the alley entrance. He wasn't watching her specifically. He was watching the street end of the alley, the way he always did, because that was the direction trouble usually came from, which meant he wasn't looking at her. She was halfway through the woodpile when she heard something further down the alley. A scuffle. A voice saying, "Get off me," in a tone that was not rhetorical. She looked up. 20 feet down the narrow alley, two men she recognized, not from the Guthrie house, but from around town, had a girl by the arms. The girl was young, not Lucy Young, but young. A market girl by the look of her, a bundle spilled on the ground where she'd dropped it. The men weren't doing anything yet, but they had the quality of men who were about to, who had already decided they were going to, and were just working out the pacing. Garrett was still watching the street end. Eliza put down the wood she was carrying. "Hey," she said. The men looked up. The girl was straining against the grip on her arm. "Let her go," Eliza said. One of the men laughed. "Mind yourself." "I am minding myself," Eliza said. She walked toward them. Her legs slowed her a little on the uneven alley ground, and she was acutely aware of that, but she kept her face neutral. "I'm minding that there are two of you and one of her, and she's clearly trying to leave. Let her go." "You work for Hale?" the other man said, squinting. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Because then Hale can tell you to mind your—" She threw the piece of firewood she'd been holding. It wasn't aimed at either of them specifically. She wasn't trying to hit anyone. She was trying to create a moment, a sudden loud impact on the alley wall between them, a crack and clatter that made them both flinch back and release the girl in the half-second of startled confusion. The girl ran. The men looked at the firewood on the ground, and then at Eliza. "The hell is wrong with you?" one of them said, and the pleasantness of the scenario had evaporated completely. They came at her together. She had time for exactly one clear thought before the first one reached her, which was, well, this went faster than expected. Then she got her elbow up to block the grab for her coat collar and went for the knife in her pocket, and the alley exploded into noise and motion, and she was doing considerably worse than she'd hoped. One of them had her by the arm, the other was trying to get the knife out of her hand. Her legs slipped on the stones, and she went down on one knee, which sent pain shooting up to her hip. And she was thinking this was foolish. This was actually foolish. And then both men were no longer touching her. They were in fact on the other side of the alley, which was confusing for the half second before she registered that there was now a third person in the alley. He was very large. That was the first thing she noticed. The second thing was that he'd put one of her two attackers against the wall with what appeared to be almost no effort. In the way that very large men sometimes accomplish things with less visible effort than the size of what they're accomplishing would suggest. The third thing she noticed was that he was looking at the second man, who had made a very rapid reassessment of his priorities and was currently in the process of leaving the alley at speed. The large man watched him go. Then he turned to look at Eliza. She was still on one knee on the alley stones, knife in hand, her coat torn at the shoulder seam. She looked up at him and she said, with the dignity available to her in that position, "I had it managed." He looked at the knife, then at the man he'd put against the wall, then back at her. "Sure," he said. His voice was low, not unkind. "I was getting to the part where I handled it," she said. "Looked like it," he said, and she couldn't tell if he was agreeing with her or not. He extended a hand to help her up. She looked at it for a moment. She took it. He pulled her to her feet with a steadiness that suggested he'd done harder things, and he kept hold of her hand just long enough to make sure she was stable, and then he let go. He was, she assessed in the thin October light of the alley, very large, yes, and dark-haired with a beard that needed attention, and wearing the kind of clothes that suggested mountains and weather, and not caring much about either. He had a rifle on his back and a scar above his left eye that had healed white against his skin. He looked like something that had grown out of the mountains rather than arrived in them. Behind her, Garrett was finally moving toward the alley. Late. Too late. The man with the rifle looked past her at Garrett, and then at the Guthrie House sign visible at the alley's end, and something moved through his expression. A recognition of something, a calculation. He looked back at her. "You work in there?" He asked it carefully. "No," Eliza said. He waited. "I'm in there against my choice," she said. "I've been there 3 days." And she wasn't sure why she told him, a stranger in an alley, except that she had approximately no options, and he was the first person she'd encountered in 3 days who wasn't connected to the Guthrie house, and who had just demonstrated a willingness to intervene in something that was none of his concern. He stood very still. Garrett arrived at her elbow. "Miss Rowan, you need to come back inside." The man with the rifle looked at Garrett, then at Eliza. "Is that your name?" he said. "Rowan?" "Eliza Rowan," she said. "Yes." Garrett's hand was on her arm now. "Inside," he said, and his voice had the quality of someone trying not to make a scene on a public adjacent street. She let herself be moved because her options in the alley were still limited and her leg hurt, and she'd already done one reckless thing today. But she looked back. The man was still there. He hadn't moved. He was watching her go, and there was something in his expression that she couldn't quite read from the distance, something that looked like deciding. She went inside. She went up to her room. She sat on the edge of the bed with her hands clasped and her heart doing something irregular in her chest, and she thought he was deciding something. She didn't know what. She hoped it was the right thing. Outside the window, October deepened into early dark, and the cold came down off the ridges, and the candle in its tin holder threw shadows on the wall of the room she hadn't chosen and hadn't agreed to and was not, she told herself firmly, going to stay in. She pressed her palms to her thighs. She waited. Down in the alley, a man named Gideon Ashcroft stood in the dark for a long moment, looking at the side door of the Guthrie house. He had come to Caldwell Creek to sell furs. He had not come to do what he was currently considering. He pulled his coat tighter against the cold, and he looked at the painted sign with the faded rose on it, and he thought about the girl's face, not afraid, or not only afraid, and the way she'd said I had it managed from her knees on the alley stones with a knife in her hand. He thought about a great many things. Then he walked toward the main street of Caldwell Creek, and he began to ask some careful questions about who owned the Guthrie house and what a man might need to make that owner listen. He had a particular look on his face while he did it, the kind that doesn't leave room for the possibility of no. Gideon Ashcroft had not planned to spend his evening in a saloon asking questions about a brothel owner. He'd planned to sell his furs to the trading post, which he'd done, 42 pelts for a fair price, eat something hot, sleep somewhere that wasn't the ground, and leave Caldwell Creek by first light, heading back up the ridge to his cabin. That was the plan. He was a man who kept to his plans because plans were what separated a functional existence from a chaotic one, and he'd had enough chaos in the years before the mountains to last him the rest of his life. But he kept thinking about the girl's face, not in a sentimental way. He wasn't given to sentiment, hadn't been since the war knocked most of it out of him. He was thinking about it in the way he thought about problems that needed solving, practically, from multiple angles, with an honest accounting of the costs. The girl had been on her knees on alley stones with a knife in her hand and her coat torn, and she'd looked at him and said, "I had it managed," in a voice that made clear she'd been managing things her entire life, mostly alone, and was deeply unimpressed by the suggestion that she couldn't. That kind of person didn't belong in the Guthrie house. He knew what the Guthrie house was. Everybody in 3 counties knew what the Guthrie house was, the same way everybody knew about the loose board on the bridge over Miller's Creek and the particular patch of ice that formed on the north slope every January. You knew about it, and you went around it, and you didn't dwell. He sat at the bar and ordered whiskey. He didn't intend to drink much of, and he asked the bartender, whose name turned out to be Roy, about the man who ran it. Roy was the kind of man who talked because he liked talking, and because the bar was quiet on a Tuesday, and because a big stranger who orders whiskey and asks careful questions in a tone that doesn't sound like gossip is usually a man with a reason. "Hale's been here going on 12 years, Roy said. He was polishing a glass that didn't need polishing. Keeps to himself mostly. Doesn't cause trouble in town. Pays his fees. A pause. Got people he works with, though. Not just the 2 men on the building. Got a whole arrangement, if you take my meaning." "What kind of arrangement?" Roy set down the glass. "The kind where a man like me doesn't ask too many questions about it." Gideon drank his whiskey slowly and absorbed this. "The man wanted to talk to Hale about a business matter," he said. "What would that look like?" Roy looked at him for a moment. "Hale comes in here Thursday evenings," Roy said. "Has a drink, sometimes 2. Sits in the back corner by himself." He went back to his glass. "I don't know what I'm going to be doing this Thursday evening, but it won't be watching who Hale talks to. That's what I can tell you." Gideon put money on the bar, more than the whiskey cost, and walked out. He found a room at the boarding house on Elm, a narrow bed in a narrow room that smelled of wood smoke and someone's old tobacco, and he lay on top of the blanket with his hands behind his head and stared at the ceiling and did his accounting. What he had, the money from the furs, which was decent, a rifle, a knife, and enough physical presence to have moved those 2 men in the alley with no particular effort. A reputation, in certain circles, as a man who had done difficult things during the war and not been broken by them, which meant he knew how negotiations with dangerous men tended to go. What he didn't have, any official standing, any connection to the law in this county, or any guarantee that Corbin Hale was the kind of man who responded to reason. What he was risking, at minimum, a great deal of trouble. At maximum, his life, which the mountains had already taught him, was a non-renewable resource. He thought about this for a long time. Then he thought about the girl, Eliza Rowan, telling him she'd been there 3 days, against her choice, with the matter-of-factness of someone reporting a weather condition rather than a catastrophe, because catastrophizing didn't fix anything, and she knew it. He closed his eyes. Thursday, he thought. 2 days. He could be back on the mountain in 2 days. He could pretend the alley hadn't happened. He was good at pretending certain things hadn't happened. It was one of the skills the war had given him that he'd never asked for and couldn't return. He knew he wasn't going to do that. He fell asleep with the accounting still running in the back of his mind, and he slept the way he always slept now, which was lightly and with one ear open, which was another gift from the war that he'd stopped resenting because resentment was expensive. The next day, he waited. He walked the town carefully, the way he walked unfamiliar terrain, learning the layout of Guthrie Street and the alley behind it, the placement of Hale's men, the rhythms of who came and went and when. He bought supplies he didn't strictly need so that he had reasons to be in different parts of town at different times. He was not by nature a patient man, but he had trained himself into patience the way you train a working dog, with repetition and consequences. On the second day, a Wednesday, he saw Eliza. She was in the upstairs window for perhaps 30 seconds, just standing there, looking out at the alley below. And she couldn't have seen him from that angle because he was further down and half in shadow. But he saw her. She had that same quality she'd had on the alley floor, that stillness that wasn't passivity, a person thinking hard about a problem, a person who had not given up. He went back to his room and finished his planning. Thursday came gray and cold with the smell of coming rain in the air. Gideon put on his better coat, which was not saying much, and walked to the saloon and sat in a chair near the back corner and waited for Corbin Hale to walk through the door. He arrived at 7:30, exactly as Roy had implied he would. He was smaller than Gideon had pictured from Eliza's brief description. Though he had an expensive quality to him, the kind of careful presentation that costs money and effort. He came in alone, which was either confidence or carelessness, and Gideon decided after a moment of observation that it was confidence. Hale was used to being the most dangerous thing in whatever room he was in, not because he was physically imposing, but because he had people and resources and the kind of long-running patience that came from 12 years of building something nobody official wanted to look at too closely. He sat in his corner. He ordered. He had been there about 10 minutes and was halfway through his first drink when Gideon picked up his glass and walked over and sat down across from him without being invited. Hale looked up. He took in Gideon's size in the way people did, a quick recalibration, but his expression didn't change much. "Don't believe I know you," he said. "No," Gideon said. "My name's Gideon Ashcroft. I run a trap line up on the North Ridge. I come to town maybe 4 times a year to sell. What can I do for you, Mr. Ashcroft?" "I want to talk to you about a girl you have at the Guthrie house. Name of Rowan." Something moved through Hale's eyes. Not alarm, more like a category of response clicking into place. He settled back in his chair. "The Guthrie house is a private establishment," he said pleasantly. "I don't generally discuss its business in saloons." "I understand that," Gideon said. "I'm asking you to make an exception." "May I ask why?" "Because I'm going to make you an offer for her release, and if you hear it, you may find it worth your time." He paused. "And because if we don't talk about it here, I'll have to find another way to address it, and that's less convenient for both of us." The pleasantness stayed on Hale's face, but something behind it shifted, an alertness, a sharpening. He was reassessing. Gideon let him. "What kind of offer?" Hale said. "What did you pay her father for her?" A pause. "That's not your concern." "I'm guessing $2 to $5, Gideon said, "based on what I know about how these arrangements tend to work." He watched Hale's face. "2 then." "All right, I'll pay you 20. Hale stared at him. $20, he said. $20. Today. Cash. "Mr. Ashcroft." Hale's voice had a careful quality to it, like a man picking his way across uncertain ground. A girl at the beginning of her working life represents considerably more than $20 and 30, then, Gideon said. "That's what I have on me." $30. He pulled it out of his coat pocket and set it on the table. Not all at once. He did it note by note, slow, so Hale could watch it accumulate. "That's more than 10 times what you paid her father, and it solves a problem." "What problem?" "The problem," Gideon said, "is that she's not going to cooperate with you. You already know that. You've had her 3 days and she hasn't." He looked at Hale steadily. "I've seen girls like her before. They don't break the way you're expecting them to, and when they don't break, they become expensive. They talk to people. They cause difficulties. They create the kind of attention that a man in your position doesn't want. You've already got a situation where she threw firewood at 2 men in your back alley." He kept his voice neutral, like he was discussing livestock. $30 now, or a year of problems. That's the offer. Hale was quiet for a moment. He looked at the money on the table. He looked at Gideon. "Why?" he said. "Just that." "Why what?" "Why does a man who traps fur on the North Ridge care enough about one girl to walk into this conversation with $30 in his hand?" Gideon considered this. He could give a number of answers. He decided on the true one, because in his experience, the true answer to a direct question was usually the one that played best with men like Hale, who were expert at detecting performance. "She reminded me of someone," he said. "That's all." Hale looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up the money, 1 note at a time, and counted it. He put it in his coat pocket. "I'll have Marta draw up a release paper," he said. "Come by the side entrance at 9 tomorrow morning." He finished his drink. "Understand that this is a business transaction, Mr. Ashcroft, not a rescue. I'm releasing my claim on her in exchange for fair compensation. That's all this is." "That's all I'm asking for," Gideon said. Hale stood. He put on his hat. "One more thing," he said. "She's not obligated to you by virtue of this arrangement. I want that understood. Whatever you're expecting in return." "I'm not expecting anything in return," Gideon said. Hale studied him. "You're a strange man," he said. "I've been told," Gideon said. Hale left. Gideon sat at the table for a while after, alone with his whiskey, and he acknowledged to himself that this had gone better than he'd had a right to expect, which meant he should be suspicious of how easy it had been. Men like Hale didn't let things go because of $30. They let things go because the calculation favored it in the short term, and they reserved the right to recalculate. He went back to the boarding house and he didn't sleep as well as the night before. At 9 the following morning, he presented himself at the side entrance of the Guthrie house. Garrett answered, and if Garrett recognized him from the alley, he gave no sign of it. Marta came to the door after a few minutes with a folded paper, a release document, written in a neat hand signed by Hale. Gideon read it twice before he was satisfied it said what it appeared to say. "The girl," he said. Marta turned back inside. He waited in the cold of the alley for what felt like too long. He was working out, in the back of his mind, what he would do if the door simply didn't open again. Whether this was Hale's way of taking his money and making his point simultaneously. He had moved through enough situations where the expected outcome didn't materialize to have a backup in most scenarios, but his backup here was thin. The door opened. Eliza Rowan came out with her cloth bag over her shoulder and her coat buttoned to the throat, and her face set in an expression that revealed absolutely nothing about how she was feeling, which Gideon suspected was deliberate and also suspected concealed a great deal. She stopped when she saw him. He watched her recognize him. The alley, the firewood, the hand pulling her up. He watched her reassemble the picture of what had happened. "You," she said. "Me," he said. "You did this?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. He couldn't read the expression. "How much did he take you for?" she asked. He told her. Something moved across her face, not quite what he expected, not relief or gratitude. Something more complicated than either. $30, she said. "Yes." "That's 15 times what he paid my father." "Thereabouts." She looked at him. "I'll pay you back." He opened his mouth. "Don't," she said. "Don't tell me I don't need to. I need to. Tell me what you want for it." "Nothing," he said. "I want nothing for it." She gave him a look that was almost angry, which was not the response he'd been expecting either, and it occurred to him that someone who'd been sold once in the past week might be very sensitive to the idea of anyone wanting anything from her. "That's not how things work," she said. "Generally, no," he agreed. "But I'm not asking you to do anything, Miss Rowan. What I'm offering is transport out of Caldwell Creek, because you standing in this alley with a cloth bag is not a plan." She looked at the alley. She looked at the Guthrie house door, now closed behind her. She looked at him. "Where?" she said. "I have a cabin," he said, "up on the North Ridge. It's not much, but it's away from here, and it's away from Hale, and you can stay there and figure out your next step without doing it from a town where Hale's men know your face." "You live alone up there?" "Yes." "And you're asking me to come to a stranger's cabin on a mountain," she said. It was not an accusation exactly, more like a confirmation that she was being clear-eyed about what was being proposed. "I'm aware of how it sounds," he said. "Do you have any idea what my other options are right now?" "Limited," he said honestly. She was quiet. "I need to get word to my brother," she said. "He's 11. He's alone up at our father's place, and he doesn't know what happened to me." "Where's the place?" "Up Ridgecroft Road, about 4 miles. "We can go past there," he said. She looked at him again, that assessing look she had, the one that went through rather than past whatever it landed on. "All right," she said. She didn't say thank you. He didn't need her to. They walked out of the alley together, and neither of them spoke for the first block, which was a more comfortable silence than it had any right to be, given that they'd spoken perhaps 30 words to each other total before today. "I don't have a horse," she said eventually. "I have 2, he said. "You brought 2 horses to town to sell furs?" "I brought one. I bought the second yesterday in case this worked out." She stopped walking. He kept walking a step before he realized and turned back. She was looking at him with an expression he couldn't read at all. You bought a horse, she said. Yes. Before you even knew if he'd agree. I like to be prepared, he said. She stared at him for another moment. Then she started walking again. When she came up alongside him, she was looking straight ahead, and her face was doing the thing again where it didn't show anything, except that she was pressing her lips together in a way that might have been someone stopping themselves from saying something, or might have been something else entirely. Gideon Ashcroft, she said. That's right. You're a strange man. So I've been told, he said, twice now, in the last 12 hours. They rode north out of Caldwell Creek in the early morning, heading first toward Ridgecroft Road. The sky had the pale gray quality of a day that might stay like that all the way through, cold without being brutal. The kind of October day that smelled like dead leaves and coming winter. Neither of them spoke much, which suited them both. The Rowan cabin looked worse in daylight than Gideon had imagined from what little she'd described. The sagging porch, the oilcloth window, the thin smoke from the chimney that suggested the fire was barely maintained. He hung back on the road while Eliza dismounted. She went to the door. Thomas came out before she'd even knocked. He must have heard the horses. He was a small boy with his sister's eyes and none of her composure, and when he saw her, he crossed the porch in 2 steps and hit her with the full force of a frightened 11-year-old, which nearly knocked her back on the bad leg, and she grabbed him and held on. Gideon looked at the trees. He heard her voice, low and steady, explaining what she could explain. He heard Thomas asking questions. Where are you going? When are you coming back? What about Papa? And he heard Eliza answering with a patience that cost her something. He could tell, the way certain kinds of patience always cost something. He heard her say, I'm going to be safe. I need you to keep being safe here. Eat the corn in the store. There's enough for a few weeks if you're careful. And if Papa, a pause, if things are bad here, you go down to the Fenwick place and you tell Mrs. Fenwick that Eliza sent you. Say exactly that. Will she help? Thomas asked. I believe she will, Eliza said. And her voice on that was careful, because it was the kind of promise you make not knowing if you can keep it. She came back to the horses a few minutes later. She didn't look back at the cabin. She mounted without asking for help, though Gideon could see from the set of her jaw that the leg made it harder than she was letting on. They rode north. The trail climbed steadily, leaving the valley floor behind, moving through stands of beech and oak that were going gold and rust, and the particular dark red that meant the sumacs had turned. The air got colder as they gained elevation. Gideon pointed out the turns without explaining much about them, and Eliza followed without asking much. And they moved through the October forest in a quiet that was almost comfortable and almost not, depending on which moment you caught it in. Tell me about this cabin, she said, after about an hour of riding. What do you want to know? Is it actually on the North Ridge? Yes. How far from town? About 7 miles by trail, longer by road, but there's no road. How long have you been up there? 3 years, he said. Alone? Mostly, he said. She absorbed this. Where'd you come from before? He considered how to answer this. Virginia, he said. Before that, the army. The war? Yes. She didn't ask which side, which he appreciated, because it was a question people usually asked, and it always landed somewhere complicated. Instead, she said, Were you a soldier long? 4 years, he said. Then I was done. And you came up here? Eventually, he said. Another silence. The trail narrowed between 2 big hardwoods, and they went through single file, and when it widened again, she pulled up alongside him. I want to understand what you expect from this arrangement, she said. Not because I'm ungrateful. I know what you did and what it cost you, and I understand what it means, but I need to know what we're walking into. He respected the directness enough to meet it straight. I have a cabin. It's got 2 rooms. You'd have the back room. I trap and hunt. There's enough food, especially with winter supplies laid in. I'm not going to ask you for anything, and I'm not going to tell you what to do, and I'm not going to suggest that $30 bought me anything other than the transaction it bought. He paused. But I'll also tell you honestly that Hale taking that money doesn't mean he's finished. Men like that don't accept a loss. They just decide on their timing. Eliza was quiet for a moment. So we need to be ready, she said. Yes. Then I need to learn what's useful up here, she said. Not asking, stating. All right, he said. They rode in silence for a while more. The trail was climbing steeply now, switchbacking up the face of the ridge, the horses working steadily under them. Through breaks in the trees, the valley spread out below. Caldwell Creek, somewhere in there, a thread of smoke, the small geometry of a town that had already done something unforgivable to her and didn't particularly know it. She was looking at it too, he realized. I keep thinking about those other women, she said. Not to him specifically, more like saying it out loud to organize it. Cora, Lucy, Dee, Pearl, they're still in there. Yes, he said, and there's nothing I can do about it right now. It wasn't a question, it was a person being honest with herself about a limitation. Not right now, he said. She turned away from the valley. Then I need to get to a position where I can, she said. Eventually, he looked at her profile, the set of her jaw, the dark hair coming loose from where she'd pinned it, the way she was sitting the horse like someone who had decided where she was going even before she knew the destination. He'd pulled her up off the alley floor 4 days ago. He didn't know her. He didn't know what she was capable of, not really, in the way that you have to know a person over time to truly understand what they're made of. But he thought, and he was not a man who formed impressions quickly or carelessly, that what Eliza Rowan was made of was something that the right conditions could turn into something formidable. He didn't say this. He turned his horse back toward the ridge trail, and they climbed. The cabin came into view an hour later, tucked into a clearing on the northeastern face of the ridge where a spring came out of the rock and a stand of hemlocks broke the worst of the north wind. It was, as he'd said, not much. One main room, a back room barely large enough for a cot and a trunk, a stone chimney that actually drew correctly, which was more than could be said for the Rowan cabin. A barn that was mostly a lean-to. A woodpile that was substantial because winter on this ridge was not a thing to underprepare for. Eliza sat on her horse and looked at it. He was braced for something. Disappointment, maybe, or the particular silence that means a person is reconciling what they imagined with what's in front of them. She said, "The chimney looks solid." "It is," he said. She dismounted. She stood for a moment, taking in the clearing, the hemlocks, the way the ridge rose above and the valley fell away below, the quality of the silence, which was the real silence of a place genuinely far from other people, and not the fake silence of a town at night. She breathed in. She picked up her cloth bag. "All right," she said, and walked to the door. He tied the horses and followed her in. She was already examining the room, the fireplace, the stores, the window placement, the single lamp on the table, the rifle on the wall. She did it the way she did everything, systematically, without commentary, like she was building a picture she intended to act on. "I'll need to earn my keep," she said, crouching by the fireplace to check the flue. Just checking, automatically, the way someone does who's been responsible for fires their entire life. "You don't—" "I know I don't have to." She glanced back at him. "But I will. That's not negotiable." He looked at this woman, this girl, really, 18 years old, who'd been sold for $2 a week ago and was now crouching by a stranger's hearth in a mountain cabin and telling him that maintaining her self-sufficiency was not negotiable. "All right," he said. She turned back to the fireplace. Outside, the October wind came down off the ridge and moved through the hemlocks with a sound like the world breathing, and the afternoon light was going fast the way it did up high this time of year, and the valley below was already going dark while the ridgetop still held a thin strip of gold. The cold was coming. They both knew it. The first week was the hardest, not because of any single thing, but because of the accumulation of small adjustments that nobody talks about when they talk about survival. Eliza had thought she understood cold. She'd grown up on a ridge in an undersupported cabin with a fireplace that smoked, and a father who sometimes forgot to bring in wood. But the cold at Gideon's elevation was a different creature. Came down off the mountain at night with a particular intention, seeping through the log walls in ways that required constant management. And the wind that moved through the hemlocks made a sound she wasn't used to yet, one that kept pulling her out of sleep in the first few nights because her body hadn't learned to distinguish it from something approaching. The leg also gave her trouble in the cold, which she'd expected and didn't mention. The old break ached from the knee down when the temperature dropped, a deep, grinding ache that had no good remedy except movement, which was inconvenient when movement was what the cold argued against. She developed a habit of starting the morning fire while Gideon was still asleep, partly because it needed doing, and partly because the heat helped, and partly because she needed something to do with herself in those early hours when the mountain was still dark and her brain was already running. Gideon noticed because he noticed most things, but he said nothing about it, which she appreciated more than any comment would have been. What they established in those first weeks was not so much a routine as a functional division of effort, arrived at without much discussion because neither of them were particularly inclined to discuss things that could be sorted out by observation. He handled the heavy trapline, the long circuit he ran through the upper ridges that took most of a day. And she handled the cabin, the fire, the cooking, what preserved food they had, mending what needed mending. But she was not willing to be confined to the domestic, and she made this clear by simply not being confined to it. On the fourth day, she followed him out to the woodpile while he was splitting and picked up the second axe. He looked at her. "I know how to split wood," she said. "I didn't say you didn't. You were going to say something." "I was going to say the technique's different with that axe. It's got a longer handle than you're probably used to." He demonstrated with his own axe, the angle, the follow-through. "You'll tire out your shoulder faster if you fight the handle." She watched. She adjusted. She was slower than him and hit wrong twice before she found the right motion, and she was aware of his awareness of her trying, but he kept his eyes on his own work, which was the right choice. By the end of the hour, she'd built a decent stack. Her shoulder hurt for 2 days. She didn't mention this either. The rifle came up on the 8th day. She'd been watching the one on the wall, a long Kentucky rifle, old but well-maintained for most of those 8 days, and she finally asked about it while they were eating. "Is that the one you came with, or did you get it here?" "Came with it," he said. "Carried it through Virginia and Tennessee and 3 years of mountains. It's accurate to about 80 yards in good conditions." "Will you show me?" He looked at her across the table. She held the look. "Have you shot before?" he asked. "My father had a flintlock. I fired it a few times, not enough to be useful." "All right," he said. "We'll start tomorrow." She'd expected more resistance than that, or at least more questions about why, and the absence of both meant she had to recalibrate something about her understanding of him. He was not, it turned out, the kind of man who required women to justify wanting to be capable. She didn't know how to account for this in her existing model of men, so she filed it separately and kept updating. They went out the next morning into the clearing where a line of birch trees stood at the far edge, pale and thin against the October sky. He set up a piece of split wood at roughly 40 yards against the largest trunk, and they started there. The rifle was heavier than the flintlock had been. He showed her the loading sequence without condescension, step by step, and he corrected her grip before she'd even fired the first shot, repositioning her hands with the direct practicality of someone who cared more about whether she got it right than about the awkwardness of touching a stranger's hands. She fired. She missed by about 2 feet to the left, which was the shoulder compensating for what it thought the recoil was going to be before the recoil actually happened. "Again," he said. She loaded. She fired. A foot left. "You're anticipating it," he said. "Your shoulder's bracing before the shot. Don't think about the recoil. Think about the target. The recoil happens after. It can't hurt your aim if you've already sent the ball." She thought about this. She loaded again. She hit the edge of the wood. Gideon said nothing, but she caught the small nod, the almost invisible acknowledgement of a man who had been teaching himself to be sparing with praise because too much of it meant nothing. She understood this instinctively. It was the same principle she'd applied to Thomas when he was learning his letters. By the end of 2 hours, she was hitting the target consistently at 40 yards, inconsistently at 60. Her shoulder was screaming. Her hands were black with powder residue. She was not particularly satisfied because she could see the distance between where she was and where she needed to be, and the distance was substantial. "That's enough for today," Gideon said. "One more," she said. "Your shoulder." "I know what my shoulder is doing," she said. "One more." He was quiet. She loaded. She took her time with the grip, the stance, the not anticipating. She looked at the target. She breathed out slowly and fired on the exhale the way he'd shown her, and the piece of wood jumped and split and she'd hit it almost center. She lowered the rifle. "All right," she said. "Now enough." He took the rifle back and she saw it again. The nod, small and real. November came in behind October and brought the first real snow, which arrived overnight and covered the clearing by morning in about 4 inches. Eliza stood in the doorway and looked at it, and the light off the snow in the early morning was very bright and very clean, and she had a complicated few seconds where the beauty of it was real and the situation was also real, and both things existed simultaneously without canceling each other out. She started thinking more systematically about escape routes, not because she was planning to leave, but because understanding the terrain around her felt necessary. She asked Gideon, on one of the mornings when they were both at the fire, to show her the ridge on a map if he had one. He did have one, a rough thing he'd drawn himself on a piece of oilskin, not to any particular scale, but accurate in the ways that mattered. He spread it on the table and showed her the cabin, the spring, the trapline circuit, the two trails down to the valley, the north trail that came out above the mill road, and the south trail that was harder going but came out closer to the creek settlement. She studied it for a long time. What's this? She pointed to a mark he'd made east of the cabin, roughly a mile. Rock formation, he said. Big granite outcrop, natural overhang. Good shelter in an emergency. I've waited out 2 storms there. How long to get there from the cabin? He looked at her. 20 minutes in good conditions. Longer in snow. He paused. What are you thinking? I'm thinking, she said, that if someone came up here looking for trouble, the cabin is the first place they'd go, and the cabin is 1 room and 1 door. He was quiet for a moment. The outcrop's defensible, he said, which was not a disagreement. I know you think he'll come, she said. Hale, you've been thinking it since the first night. He didn't deny it. I think he will, she said. I think $30 doesn't settle a man like that. I think it offended him. She folded her hands on the oilskin map. I'd rather be ready for it than surprised by it. So would I, he said. They sat with that for a moment. Tell me about the war, she said. Not to change the subject, she meant it practically. I don't need the history of it, but you were a soldier 4 years. That means you know things about defending a position. He looked at her. Then he looked at the map. It means I know some things, he said. Yeah. Then tell me what you know, she said. That applies to this. He was quiet for a moment, not reluctant, more like organizing. When he spoke, it was in the same tone he used to explain the rifle. Direct, practical, no flourishes. A position's only as good as your knowledge of what's coming at it, he said. You need eyes further out than the cabin. Early warning. Something that tells you someone's on the trail before they reach the clearing. He tapped a point on the map. There's a natural choke point here, where the north trail narrows between 2 boulder faces. A trip line there, just a cord and some noise, would give you maybe 5 minutes of notice. That's enough to prepare, she said. Or to get to the outcrop, he said. I'm not running to the outcrop, she said very quietly. Not unless I have no other option. He looked at her face. He seemed to understand that arguing this particular point was not a productive use of either of their time. They built the trip line the next morning, working in the cold with numb fingers, running a length of cord across the north trail between the 2 boulder faces and connecting it to 3 empty tin cans Eliza had found in the cabin stores. Simple, cheap, effective. Gideon had used similar systems in the war, and he showed her how to set the tension so that anything heavier than a deer crossing it would set the cans rattling. They also moved the rifle to a position she could access faster. And Eliza took a spare powder horn and balls and put them in the back room in the corner behind the cot, so that they existed independently of the main room supplies. Redundancy, she explained to Gideon when he watched her do this. If the main room was the problem, the back room needed to be self-sufficient. He hadn't thought of this. He told her so, which cost him something. A man who'd been managing his own survival for 3 years, admitting that an 18-year-old girl had caught something he hadn't. But he told her anyway, because it was true, and because ignoring true things got people killed. I kept the family accounts for 6 years, she said, as if this explained the redundancy thinking. When you don't have enough of anything, you stop putting everything in one place. He thought about that for a while. She had been at the cabin for 3 weeks when she asked about Thomas again, and the asking was complicated, carrying weight of sustained worry that she hadn't been putting anywhere visible. Is there any way to get word to him, she said, without, I don't want anyone to know where I am, but he doesn't know if I'm alive. Gideon thought about it. There's a man I sell furs to, he said. Dan Whitmore. Runs the trading post. He's not connected to Hale, and he's close-mouthed by nature. I could go down, Not to Caldwell Creek, to the settlement on the North Road, and send a message through him. Would he do it? For a fair price, Gideon said. Yes. How much? Don't worry about... She gave him a look. $1, he said. Maybe less. I'll add it to the account, she said. He went the following Tuesday. She waited, which was worse than doing anything, and spent the day going over the cabin's winter stores with more thoroughness than was strictly necessary because she needed something to do with her hands and her mind. He came back late afternoon with supplies and a message from Whitmore. Whitmore had a connection who sometimes went up Ridgecroft Road for trade, and word could reach Thomas within the week. Thomas would know she was safe. He wouldn't know where. She received this information with a stillness that was not actually stillness, but something that looked like it from the outside. Thank you, she said. It's nothing, he said. It's not nothing, she said, and her voice was flat in the way that meant it was covering something, and he left it alone. That night she sat by the fire for a long time after the lamp was out, and she thought about Thomas eating the corn store, doing his arithmetic by firelight, waking up from nightmares with nobody there to hear him. She thought about Cora and Pearl and Dee and Lucy at the Guthrie house. She thought about her father and tried to find something that wasn't anger or grief in what she felt about him, and found she couldn't, and decided that was probably correct for now. She thought about being 18 years old and sitting in a stranger's cabin on a mountain in November because the alternative was worse. She thought about Corbin Hale counting $30 in a saloon and smiling the smile that didn't reach his eyes. She fed another piece of wood into the fire. The tin cans on the north trail rattled once in the wind, and she was on her feet before she'd consciously registered the sound, moving toward the back room for the powder and shot. And then the wind died, and there was only the hemlock sound, and she stood in the middle of the room in the dark with her heart going fast in her chest. False alarm. She went back to the fire. She sat for a while longer, just breathing. She was almost calm again when she heard it. Not the wind this time. Gideon heard it too because he appeared in the doorway of his room without a word, rifle already in hand, and they looked at each other in the firelight. 3 cans. The full length of cord. Not wind. Someone was on the north trail. Back room, he said. No, she said. Eliza, I have the shot and powder. You need a loader. He looked at her for 1 second, assessing, not arguing, and then he moved to the window. She moved to the back room doorway where she could access the supplies and still see the main room. Her hands were steady. She made herself breathe through her nose, slow and even, the way she breathed when the fear was real and breathing was the only thing she had direct control over. Outside, the snow creaked under something heavy. More than one something. Gideon had the rifle at the window. The shutter cracked 2 inches, enough to see, not enough to be seen. He held up 3 fingers without turning around. She counted. 3 men outside that he could see. Could be more. She thought of Marta's voice the first morning at the Guthrie house. Hale has 2 men on the building at night. 3, sometimes, on weekends. She thought of Cora saying the name Kelsey, in the particular tone people use for things they're afraid of. The knock on the door when it came was the most civil-sounding thing about the entire situation. 3 deliberate raps like a man who wanted you to believe he had every right to be there. Gideon didn't move from the window. Ashcroft. The voice from outside was flat and competent, the voice of a man doing a job he was good at. We're not here for trouble. Mr. Hale just wants to talk. Gideon's jaw tightened. He glanced back at Eliza. She shook her head. He already knew, she could tell. But he asked anyway. What does Hale want to talk about? Terms, the voice said. He feels the previous arrangement was premature. He's prepared to be generous. Tell him the arrangement stands, Gideon said. A pause, then, Mr. Ashcroft, open the door. No, Gideon said. Another pause, longer. Then the door came off its hinges. Not broken, lifted. The leather hinges cut from outside, which told her they'd been working on it quietly for longer than the conversation had lasted. She had maybe a second of seeing it fall inward before the first man was through it, a large shape in the firelight, and Gideon swung the rifle butt into his midsection before he'd cleared the threshold, and the man went down, making a sound like a man who'd had the air removed from him. The second man came through fast and low and hit Gideon from the side. She saw Gideon stagger, lose the rifle, and she moved. She came out of the doorway with the powder horn and shot but no loaded weapon, which meant she had one option, and she took it. She threw the powder horn into the fire. She'd thought about what would happen if she did this. She had not thought it would be quite this loud. The eruption of black powder in the fireplace was not an explosion. It was a massive, instantaneous flare, a wall of heat and light and concussive force that blew outward into the room and knocked the second man sideways off Gideon and sent everyone's vision white for a moment. The fire itself went out. The room went dark except for a single burning log on the hearth. Eliza was already moving. She'd shut her eyes a half-second before and pressed against the doorframe, so she had maybe 5 seconds of functional sight that the others didn't. She found Gideon's rifle on the floor. She found Gideon by sound. His breathing, his location, the direction he was moving. She pressed the rifle into his hands. There was a third man still outside. She could hear him at the door. He hadn't come through, which meant he'd either been the cautious one or he'd been given a secondary job, which was worse because it meant Hale had planned for contingencies. The cautious man came through the door with a lantern. The lantern was both a mistake and an advantage for him. It let him see, but it also lit him up against the dark doorway, and Gideon was already turning, already bringing the rifle around. And the man with the lantern had time to take in exactly what was happening before the rifle was at his chest. "Put it down," Gideon said. His voice had a quality she hadn't heard from him before. Not angry, just stripped of everything else. Just the words. The lantern went down. The second man, the one the powder flash had thrown sideways, was getting up slowly, one hand on the wall. The first man was still on the floor near the door, not unconscious but not ready to try anything. "Here's what happens now," Gideon said, and he was addressing the room, all 3 of them. "You walk out of my cabin. You go back down the trail. You tell Hale what happened, including the part where you couldn't do the job he sent you to do. You tell him the arrangement stands." He paused. "And you tell him the next time he sends men up my mountain, I won't be the one standing in here with a rifle. She will." The man with the lantern looked at Eliza. She met his eyes. She thought about the alley floor and Corbin Hale's smooth face, and Thomas eating corn alone in a rotting cabin, and the women in the yellow-lit room on Guthrie Street. She thought about her father looking at the table. Whatever was in her face was apparently sufficient. The 3 men left. She and Gideon stood in the dark, ruined cabin. Door off its hinges, fire dead, the smell of black powder sitting heavy in the air. And for a moment neither of them moved or spoke. Then she heard herself laughing. She hadn't expected it. It came out thin and a little wrong, the way things do when your body isn't sure what to do with what just happened and picks something adjacent. Gideon looked at her. "Sorry," she said. That's not funny. I don't know why It's all right," he said. She pressed her hand over her mouth, got herself back. The laughing stopped. She looked at the door on the floor, then at the dead fireplace, then at the powder residue on the hearthstones. "We need a new door," she said. "Yes," he said, "and the fire needs relighting." "Yes." "Can you fix the hinges?" "Tomorrow," he said. "It's too dark now." She nodded. She crossed to the fireplace and found the piece of burning log that had rolled to the edge of the hearth and hadn't gone out completely, and she used it to start the fire over from nothing. Dried grass first, then small wood, then building it back up carefully, the way she'd been building fires her entire life. Gideon wedged the door back into its frame as best he could and braced it with a chair and came to sit by the fire. They were both quiet for a long time. "He's going to try again," she said. Not a question. "Yes," Gideon said. He was looking at his hands. There was blood on his knuckles from the second man, she noticed, and she got up without being asked and found the cloth she used for cleaning rifle parts and wet it from the water basin and handed it to him. He looked at it for a moment, then at her. "The powder horn," he said. "That was quick thinking." "I planned it," she said. "I've been thinking about what I'd do if they came. That was one of the things I thought." He absorbed this. "You're not what I expected," he said. "What did you expect?" He seemed to think honestly about it. "Someone who needed more time," he said. She sat back down. "I didn't have more time," she said. "I haven't had more time in years." She looked at the fire she'd rebuilt, the flames catching now, steadying. Gideon, we can't just keep waiting for him to send more men. No, he said. We need to do something that ends it, not just defends against it. She turned to look at him. Tell me you've been thinking about that too. The firelight moved across his face. I've been thinking about it, he said. Outside, the wind moved through the hemlocks. The temperature was dropping and the snow on the clearing was going hard and bright under the rising moon. 3 men were on the North Trail heading back to Caldwell Creek with a story and a failure and a message. And in the cabin on the ridge, 2 people sat by a rebuilt fire and began for the first time to think about going on offense. The going on offense part turned out to be considerably more complicated than either of them had made it sound sitting by the fire that night. The problem was not courage. They had enough of that between them, maybe too much, which was its own kind of danger. The problem was that wanting to end something and having the means to end it were 2 different accounting columns. And when Eliza sat down the next morning with a piece of paper and started actually working through what they had versus what they needed, the gap was sobering. What they had, 2 people, 1 mountain cabin, 1 rifle, and whatever Gideon's 3 years in the territory had taught him about the county's back channels. What they needed to actually dismantle Corbin Hale's operation rather than just survive it was evidence, standing, and someone with the legal authority to act on both. None of those things lived on the North Ridge. Tell me everything you know about how the county operates, she said to Gideon over breakfast. She had the paper in front of her, which he'd learned by now meant she was building a picture she intended to act on. Who enforces what? Who answers to who? He told her. The county sheriff was a man named Aldous Greer, who had been sheriff for 9 years and was either complicit with Hale's operation or willfully ignorant of it, which in practice amounted to the same thing. The county seat was in Harlan, 18 miles south. The federal circuit court sent a judge through twice a year, most recently in September, which meant the next visit was spring. But federal presence was different from local presence. A federal marshal had different reach than a county sheriff and different obligations. Has anyone ever complained to a federal office about the Guthrie House? She asked. Not that I know of, he said. Or about the other establishments Hale runs. Gideon looked at her. How do you know about the others? Cora told me, she said, before I left. She said she'd heard him mention other houses in other counties. 2 at least. She set down her pencil. 1 man running 1 house in 1 town is a local problem. 1 man running multiple operations across county lines starts to look like something federal investigators care about. He was quiet for a moment, thinking it through. You'd need to prove the cross-county piece, he said. Names, locations, the connection between them and Hale. I know things, she said. I was there 4 days. I listened. Hale talked more than he should have because he didn't take me seriously enough to be careful. She tapped the paper. I remember the name of the county he mentioned. I remember a man's name, someone he referred to as his partner in the Eastern arrangement. I don't know if that's enough. It might be enough to start a conversation, Gideon said slowly. With who? There's a federal marshal's office in Knoxville, he said. I know a man, served with him. He went into federal law after the war. His name is Calloway, Samuel Calloway. He paused. I haven't spoken to him in 3 years. I don't know what his jurisdiction covers or whether he'd be willing to walk into a county where the sheriff is Hale's pocket. Would he listen to you? He'd hear me out, Gideon said. Whether he'd act on it is a different question. She looked at the paper, at the sparse notes she'd made, at the list of what they had and what they needed. Write him, she said. It'll take weeks for a letter to... I know it'll take weeks, she said. We have time. What we don't have is the ability to keep defending this cabin indefinitely. She met his eyes. Hale's not going to stop? You know that. Next time he won't send 3 men, he'll send 6, and he'll send them when the snow is deep enough that we can't move easily. She put the pencil down. We have to go to the problem before the problem comes back to us. Gideon wrote the letter that evening by firelight, in the careful handwriting of a man who'd received a decent education before the war interrupted it. Eliza watched him write and didn't offer to help with the wording because the relationship between Gideon and Calloway was Gideon's to navigate, and she understood the difference between contributing and overriding. But when he finished and read it back to himself, she asked if she could see it. He handed it across. She read it twice. It was honest and it was spare, and it asked for a meeting rather than making demands, which was right. She handed it back. There's one thing missing, she said. What? Your return address, she said. Not the cabin. Whitmore's trading post on the North Road. Somewhere a federal man could find without knowing this mountain. He added it. The letter went out Tuesday with Whitmore's connection, folded into an oilskin packet, addressed to the federal marshal's office in Knoxville. They settled in to wait, which was the part neither of them was naturally suited for. November deepened. The snow came and went and came again. Eliza shot the rifle every day that conditions allowed, and her accuracy at 80 yards was now good enough that Gideon had stopped commenting on it and started expecting it, which was the better compliment. She asked him to show her the things he knew from the war. Not the history of it, the practical knowledge. How to move through terrain without sound. How to read an approach. How to know when someone was watching you before they announced it. He taught her the way he taught everything, without condescension, and she learned the way she learned everything, which was to break it into components and master each one before moving to the next. They talked more as the weeks went on, not about large things usually. The large things were present enough without being specifically addressed. They talked about the kind of things that people talk about when they're in close quarters, and the outside world is snow and hemlocks and the functional necessity of getting along. What had worked and what hadn't on the trap line, whether the South Trail was passable yet, whether the corn store would hold until February. But sometimes the other things came through. One evening she told him about her mother, not the death, which was the obvious part, but what she'd been like before. A woman who laughed loudly and read aloud from whatever book she could get her hands on, and once spent an entire afternoon teaching Eliza to identify birds by their calls, sitting on the rotting porch with a patience that was both genuine and slightly theatrical. She sounds like someone who made the most of things, Gideon said. She didn't have much choice, Eliza said, but she didn't make it look like a sacrifice, which is harder. He nodded. She looked at the fire. What about your family? She asked. Mother died when I was young, he said. Father ran a mill in Virginia. Still does, probably. He was quiet. We didn't correspond much after the war. Disagreement about choices I made. Which side? She said. She'd wondered since the beginning and hadn't asked. Union, he said, in a Virginia family, which tells you something about how Christmases went. He said it without bitterness, more like reporting a geographic fact. Is that why you came up here? Partly, he said. He looked at his hands, then at the fire. Also the war itself. You spend 4 years in it, you want somewhere quiet afterward. Somewhere where the problems are between you and the mountain, not between you and everything else. She understood this in a way she didn't know how to say, so she didn't say it. Instead, she said, Do you miss people? Other than, being up here alone. He considered this honestly. Some, he said. Calloway. A few others from the regiment. A pause. Mostly I find it easier not to. She nodded. I find it harder, she said. Not to. He looked at her. Thomas, she said. The women at the Guthrie house. A pause. Even people I'm angry at. I can be furious at my father and still... She stopped. I don't know how to explain it. You don't have to, he said. I miss the version of him that might have existed, she said. Is that different from missing someone? He thought about it. I think it might be worse, he said. They let that sit. Calloway's reply came on the 16th of December, which was fast enough that it suggested the letter had reached someone who cared about its contents. Gideon fetched it from Whitmore's and came back up the trail in the late afternoon with the oilskin packet and snow on his shoulders, and he handed it to Eliza without opening it, which she noted. She opened it. Samuel Calloway wrote economically, in the manner of a man who'd spent years putting facts in order for legal purposes. He was aware of Hale's name. That was the first thing she registered, the word aware, which meant Hale had come up before in federal context and hadn't been addressed yet. He was interested in the cross-county information. He would need statements, named, signed. He would need to meet with both of them, not by letter, before he could take any formal action. He was prepared to travel as far as the Harlan County line, which was 8 miles south of Caldwell Creek, for an initial meeting. He named a date in January, a Thursday, at a tavern called Greer's Crossing, which was deliberately not in Hales County. She read it twice and handed it to Gideon. He read it. Aware, she said. Yeah, he said. That means someone else tried before us, she said, and it didn't go anywhere. Or it means he's been building a case and we're a piece of it, Gideon said. Could be either. She thought about this. The distinction mattered. If they were the first real move against Hale, Calloway was starting from scratch with them. If they were joining a case already in progress, there was structure to slot into, but also politics she couldn't see yet. We go, she said. It's a risk, he said. Not an objection. He was being honest about the accounting. Everything is a risk, she said. Sitting here is a risk. Not doing this is a risk. She folded the letter. We go. He nodded. They spent the weeks before January preparing, which meant Eliza spent a great deal of time with the folded paper she'd carried since the first night, her accounting of the Rowan cabin's debts and resources. Writing on the other side of it, everything she could remember from her 4 days at the Guthrie house. Names, dates she was certain of, things she'd heard Hale say, and in what context. The name he'd mentioned, Deveros, an Eastern partner, and the county, what she'd observed about the operation's structure. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, methodically, without embellishment, with a clear distinction between what she knew for certain and what she'd inferred. Gideon added what he'd learned from Roy at the saloon and from his own observation of the building's layout and personnel over the 2 days before he'd approached Hale. Together it was more than she'd expected when she started. She also wrote down what had been done to the women in that house, because that part needed to exist on paper too, even though it was the hardest part, even though writing it meant sitting with it in a way that the forward motion of survival had mostly allowed her to avoid. She wrote it anyway. She wrote Cora's 3 years, she wrote Pearl's scar, she wrote Lucy's age, 16, and the word taken, because that was the word Lucy had used and it deserved to stay in Lucy's words. When she finished, she put the paper down and sat for a while, not doing anything. Gideon came in from outside, saw her face, and put water on for coffee without being asked, and didn't say anything until she was ready to talk. It needs to be enough, she said finally. All of this. It needs to be enough for him to act. It's substantial, Gideon said, but is it enough? He sat down. He looked at the pages. I don't know, he said. I can't promise you that. Neither can Calloway. She pressed her palms flat on the table. I know, she said. I needed to say it out loud. I know, he said. The January meeting day came in cold and clear. They left before first light, both of them armed. Gideon with the rifle, Eliza with the bone-handled knife she'd carried since the first night, and a small pistol Gideon had given her from a locked box under his cot, a short-barreled thing that had belonged to his regiment and that she'd been practicing with for 2 weeks. They took the south trail down to the valley, and then the road that swung wide around Caldwell Creek and came out on the Harlan County Road, 8 miles of cold riding that took most of the morning. Greer's Crossing Tavern was smaller than its name suggested. A single room, low ceiling, 3 tables, a fireplace that had been burning long enough to make the room genuinely warm. When they came in, a man was already at the back table. He was maybe 40, lean in the way of someone who'd once been heavier, and life had since trimmed down. He had a federal badge on his coat that he wasn't hiding, which she took as a deliberate signal about the kind of conversation this was. He had a face that had seen a great deal and organized most of it into a professional neutrality that had probably started as performance, and by now was just how his face sat. He stood when they came in. Gideon, he said. Sam, Gideon said. They shook hands with the particular quality of men who'd been in dangerous places together and didn't need to perform anything for each other. Calloway looked at Eliza. She met his eyes directly. Miss Rowan, he said. Thank you for coming. Thank you for making the ride, she said. She sat down and she put the folded pages on the table. I've written down everything I know. Dates, names, specifics, what I'm certain of and what I'm inferring, labeled separately. She paused. I'd like you to read it before we talk, so you know what we're working with. Calloway looked at the pages, then at her. Something moved through his expression, not surprise exactly, but a recalibration. The kind a person does when what they were expecting and what's in front of them turn out to be different things. He picked up the pages and read. She and Gideon waited. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved down the valley. She kept her hands still in her lap and watched Calloway's face while he read, looking for information in the way his eyes moved, whether they slowed or quickened on certain sections, whether anything caused the professional neutrality to shift. It shifted on the Eastern County section. His eyes stopped moving for a moment, not long, 2 seconds, and then continued. He read the section about the women last. His face did the thing where it stayed neutral on the surface and did something else underneath. He set the pages down. Devereaux, he said. Yes, she said. You heard Hale use that name yourself. Directly, she said. He was speaking to Marta, the woman who manages the house. He said Devereaux's arrangement in the Eastern County, and then said something about a schedule that I didn't fully hear, but I heard that much clearly. Calloway looked at Gideon. We've had the name Devereaux in connection with 2 other operations in 2 other states, he said. We couldn't place him in this region. Now you can, Gideon said. Maybe. Calloway picked up the pages again, not to read, but to hold, the way a person holds something they're deciding the weight of. Miss Rowan, I want to be honest with you about what this process looks like from here, because I think you deserve that more than you deserve reassurances. Please, she said, what you have here is useful. It's more than useful. It's the best direct account we've had of the Guthrie House operation from someone who was inside it. He paused. But to use it in a federal proceeding, I need a signed statement. Your name attached to these facts, formally, in a way that Hale's lawyers will be able to see and challenge. She didn't flinch. All right. That means Hale will know you've spoken to us, he said. His people will know your name is in the record. His people already know my name, she said. They've been to the cabin. They know where I am. Calloway looked at Gideon. 3 men, 5 weeks ago, Gideon said. We handled it. I see, Calloway said. He looked at Eliza again, and something in his professional neutrality made room, just briefly, for something that was not neutral at all. You've been through a great deal. I have, she said. But I'm here, which means I'm still able to do something about it. I'd like to do something about it. He was quiet for a moment. There will be a formal hearing, he said. I need to gather evidence from multiple sources before I can move on Hale directly, and that will take time, possibly months. During that time, you need to be somewhere Hale can't reach you easily. He looked between them. That cabin on the ridge. We've managed so far, Gideon said. You managed 3 men, Calloway said. If Hale feels the walls closing in, he won't send 3 men. He said it plainly, without trying to frighten them, just making sure the arithmetic was clear. The 3 of them sat with this. What are you suggesting? Eliza asked. Stay on the mountain for now, he said. Don't come to Caldwell Creek. Let me work the case from my end. I have other sources. I have the Devereaux connection to pursue now, which opens things considerably. He looked at her. When I'm ready to move, I'll send word through Whitmore. At that point, we'll need your statement in person before a federal judge. He paused. Can you do that? She thought about sitting in a room and recounting, formally, everything that had happened to her and what she'd witnessed done to others. She thought about a lawyer asking her questions in a tone designed to undermine. She thought about Cora, about Pearl, about Lucy, who was 16, who had been taken. Yes, she said. I can do that. Calloway gathered the pages carefully and folded them into his own coat. There's one more thing I need to ask you, he said, and his voice went a degree quieter, which told her this was the part he'd been building to. Your father, Edmund Rowan, he signed a paper with Hale. She kept her face still. I know, she said. That paper may be relevant to the case, he said. It establishes that Hale was treating a person as a purchasable commodity, which speaks to the nature of the operation, but it also means your father's name will be in the proceeding. She breathed in slowly. What happens to him? She asked. That depends on what he's willing to do, Calloway said. If he cooperates, if he's willing to testify about how the transaction happened, who approached who, what Hale's involvement looked like, it factors into how the proceeding treats him. She looked at the table. She thought about her father's hands on his face in the firelight, the way he hadn't been able to meet her eyes. We needed the $2, Eliza, the quality of a man who had done something irreversible and was only beginning to understand it. I can't speak for him, she said. I'm not asking you to, Calloway said. I'm asking if you'd object to us approaching him. She sat with this for a long time. No, she said finally. I don't object. Her voice was flat but not cold, Somewhere in between. Whatever he decides is his to decide. Calloway nodded. Outside, the afternoon was going dark fast, the way January afternoons do in mountain country, and they had the South Trail to make before the temperature dropped further. Eliza stood and buttoned her coat, and she picked up the pistol she'd set on the bench beside her and put it back in her pocket, and she was aware of Calloway watching her do this without comment. At the door, she stopped. "Those other women," she said, without turning around. "Cora, Pearl, Lucy, Dee, they're still in that house right now." "I know," Calloway said. "When this moves, when you're ready to go at Hale directly, they need to be out first, before he has time to move them." She turned. "That's not negotiable for me." Calloway looked at her steadily. "Understood," he said. "I give you my word on that." She held his eyes for a moment. Then she walked out into the January cold. Gideon fell in beside her. They untied the horses and mounted and started south, the road empty in both directions, the sky going the deep gray of late afternoon. She could feel the cold through her coat, but she was also still warm from the inside of the tavern, from the fire, from the heat of the conversation that had finally been a conversation she'd chosen to have, and not one that was being done to her. She breathed out, and her breath made a cloud in the cold air. "How do you feel?" Gideon asked. She considered this honestly. "Afraid," she said, "and also something that isn't the opposite of afraid but exists at the same time as it." She didn't have a better word for it. "Is that how the war felt?" He rode for a moment before answering. "Sometimes," he said. "The times when you knew what you were doing and why. When it wasn't just surviving. When it was actually aimed at something." She nodded. They turned north toward the mountain, into the cold and the coming dark, and she held the reins steadily and let the horse find its footing on the familiar road. And she thought about spring and courtrooms and what it would feel like to say it all out loud in a room where someone official had to write it down. She thought, "I can do that." And unlike a great many things she'd told herself over the past months, she was almost certain it was true. Calloway's word turned out to be worth something. That was not a thing Eliza had assumed going in, because she'd spent enough of her life watching people's words detach themselves from their intentions the moment circumstances made it convenient. She'd filed his promise about the women in the same folder as things she hoped for, but could not count on, and she'd ridden back up the mountain in January telling herself that hope and planning were two different tools, and she needed more of the second. But in late February, word came through Whitmore that the Guthrie house had been visited by federal officers on a Tuesday morning, not raided, visited, which was the careful legal distinction, and that Cora, Pearl, Dee, and Lucy had been removed to a temporary arrangement in Harlan under the court's supervision before Hale had been formally served with anything. Calloway had moved the women first, as promised, and then moved on Hale, which meant Hale hadn't had time to move them somewhere less findable. Eliza read Whitmore's message 3 times standing in the cold outside the trading post. Gideon on his horse a few feet back waiting, and she felt something release in her chest that she hadn't fully known was clenched. "They're out," she said. "All 4? "All 4, she said. She folded the message. She stood for a moment in the February cold with her eyes on the tree line. "All right," she said, and got back on her horse. The months between February and the spring hearing were the strangest of her life, which was a competition with strong entries. They were waiting months, and she had never been good at waiting, but she had learned something from the mountain about the patience that isn't passive, the patience of a thing still growing that can't be rushed without being ruined. She kept shooting, she kept learning the terrain. She worked on her statement, refining it, going through it line by line the way she'd gone through the family accounts, making sure every word was accurate and every inference was labeled as such. She also thought a great deal about what came after, which was a thing she'd been deliberately not doing since October because after had felt too theoretical to spend resources on. Now it felt possible enough to be frightening in a new way. Thomas came to the cabin in March, which was Gideon's idea, mentioned quietly one evening as they were eating. "If you want," he'd said, "I could go get him. Bring him up for a while, let you see he's all right." She'd looked at him across the table for a moment. "You'd do that," she said. Not a question. She was just verifying her own understanding. "It's a half-day's ride," he said, as if that settled the question of whether it was trouble. Thomas arrived on a Wednesday, taller than she remembered, which was only possible if she'd been away longer than it felt. He came into the clearing on Gideon's second horse, looking like a boy who was trying to look like he hadn't been worried, and the attempt lasted until he saw Eliza on the porch, and then he stopped trying. She came down the steps, and he said, I didn't know if you were dead, in a voice that was cracking slightly at the edges in the way of 11-year-old boys whose voices are doing what they do. I know, she said. I'm sorry. And she held on, and he let her. He stayed a week. He was watchful around Gideon at first, the wariness of a child who'd had one large man in his life and drawn conclusions from the experience. But Gideon was not a man who needed children to be comfortable around him in order to behave consistently, and consistency was what Thomas had been starved of. So by the third day, the wariness had dropped to a manageable level, and by the fifth day, Thomas was asking Gideon questions about the trap line with the focused curiosity of a boy who'd been cooped up alone too long. He's a good kid, Gideon said to Eliza on the evening of the fifth day, the two of them sitting outside in the early March cold while Thomas slept inside. He is, she said. He deserved better than what he got. So did you, Gideon said. She didn't answer that directly. She looked at the stars, which were very clear at this elevation, and she thought about better and what it meant and whether it was something you were owed or something you built. I've been thinking about after, she said. Gideon waited. After the hearing. After whatever happens with Hale. She pulled her coat tighter. I can't stay on this mountain forever. I need to think about Thomas, about what I do with him, where we go. You can stay, Gideon said. His voice was careful, which was unusual for him. I know you mean that, she said. I do mean it. She looked at him. He was looking at the tree line, not at her, which she'd learned was how he handled things he found difficult to say directly. Tell me what you actually mean, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I mean that this doesn't have to be temporary, he said, if you don't want it to be. He paused. That's all I'm saying. She sat with that. That's not nothing, she said. No, he agreed. I need to get through the hearing first, she said. I can't think about the rest of it until I've done that. All right, he said, and he meant that too. Thomas went home the following Wednesday, reluctantly, with Gideon's promise to bring him back up in summer, which Eliza noted he made without consulting her, and which she found she didn't mind. Calloway's summons came in April. The hearing was set for the second week of May at the federal courthouse in Knoxville, which meant Eliza had 3 weeks to prepare herself for something she'd been preparing for since January without quite being able to prepare for it. The night before they left for Knoxville, she sat at the table with her statement in front of her and read it through one more time, and it was, as it had always been, accurate, detailed, and very hard to read. Not because of the language, which was plain, because of what the plainness contained. Gideon came and sat across from her. He didn't ask if she was ready because he knew that was the wrong question. What are you thinking? He said. I'm thinking about Corbin Hale sitting in that courtroom, she said, and what he looks like when he can't use the smile. She pressed her palms flat on the paper. I'm thinking about whether it's enough. Calloway says it's enough, Gideon said. Between your statement, the Devereaux connection, what the other women have said, Calloway's job requires him to be confident, she said. Not harshly, just accurately. Fair, he said. And I know it's probably enough, she said. I know that in my head. She stopped. I've never trusted a process before. I've always had to handle things myself because the process wasn't available or didn't care or both. She looked at him. What if I put everything I have into this room, in front of this judge, and it isn't enough? What do I do with that? Gideon thought about this honestly, which she appreciated more than reassurance. You'd know you did it anyway, he said. That matters, even when it doesn't feel like it matters. He paused. And then you figure out what else can be done. That's what you do. It's what you've always done. She looked at him across the table, this large, quiet, scarred man who'd walked into her alley disaster 3.5 months ago and decided, for reasons that still didn't entirely add up on paper, but made a certain kind of human sense, that it was his problem too. Why did you do it? She said. He knew what she meant. I told you, he said. You reminded me of someone. You never said who. He was quiet for a moment. My sister, he said. She died when she was 16. She had that same quality you have. The one where you can see exactly how smart she is from across a room. He looked at his hands. She got sick. Nothing dramatic about it. She just died of something that took her fast and shouldn't have been able to if we'd had the money for a doctor in time. He paused. That's all it was. You reminded me of her, and I thought I couldn't do anything for her, but maybe I could do something. Eliza was quiet. I'm sorry about your sister, she said. It was a long time ago, he said, which was not the same as saying it didn't matter anymore, and they both knew it. She folded the statement. Gideon, she said, after the hearing, whatever happens, I want to stay, if that's still what you mean. He looked at her. That's still what I mean, he said. She nodded. She went to bed and she slept, improbably, fairly well. The federal courthouse in Knoxville was the most imposing building Eliza had ever been inside. High ceilings, stone floors, the particular kind of institutional quiet that made your footsteps sound louder than they were. She walked in with Gideon on one side and Calloway on the other, and she wore the best clothes she had, which were not especially fine, and she held the statement in her hands and she was afraid in the clean, functional way that she'd learned to be afraid. Present, but not in charge. Hale was there. She'd known he would be, and knowing hadn't fully prepared her for the reality of it. He was dressed carefully, his lawyers flanking him, and he looked exactly as he always looked. Smooth, composed, the face that revealed nothing. When she came in, he looked at her, and she looked at him, and she held it until he was the one who looked away. That was the only moment of it that felt like winning, and she held it in her chest like a coal. She gave her statement from the witness chair in a room with a federal judge and a packed gallery and Hale's lawyers already sharpening their questions. She spoke for 2 hours. She spoke the way she'd learned to do everything on the mountain, methodically, with clear distinctions between what she knew and what she'd inferred, and without the kind of emotional performance that defense lawyers like to point at and call hysteria. The lawyers came at her hard on 3 points: her credibility as someone with a personal grievance, the reliability of 4-day-old memories, and whether her father's transaction constituted what the law actually defined as trafficking or merely a private civil matter of disputed legality. On the first point, she said, having a personal grievance doesn't make what I witnessed untrue. It means I had more reason to pay attention. On the second, she said, I kept written accounts of my family's finances for 6 years. I don't misremember numbers or names. On the third, she didn't answer the legal question because that wasn't her job. She said, I was 18 years old. I was transported to a building I was not permitted to leave for purposes I did not agree to. Whatever you call that legally, I've told you what it was in practice. The gallery was very quiet when she said this. The other women testified over the following 2 days. Cora, who had been there 3 years and whose account was detailed and devastating. Dee, who spoke about Kelsey by name and in specifics that made the room go cold. Pearl, who was quiet but did not waver. And Lucy, who was 17 now, who had been there since she was 15, who said what had been done to her in a voice so flat and steady that it was more affecting than tears would have been. Eliza sat in the gallery for Lucy's testimony, and she kept her face still and her hands in her lap, and she let it be what it was, because looking away from it wasn't something she was willing to do. Calloway's federal case landed on Hale from 3 directions simultaneously: the trafficking operation in this county, the Devereaux connection to operations in 2 others, and a financial fraud element that Calloway had developed separately and that Eliza hadn't known about. Hale's composure held for most of it. It cracked, just slightly, when the Eastern County evidence came in. The thing he hadn't known she'd heard, the name she'd remembered from a conversation he hadn't thought she was paying attention to. She watched him understand in that moment that $2 had been the most expensive decision of his life. The verdict on the main charges came at the end of the 2nd week. Guilty on the trafficking counts. Guilty on the interstate conspiracy. The fraud charges were referred to a separate proceeding. Hale was taken out of the courtroom still composed, still wearing the smooth face, still the man who managed his presentation above everything else. She watched him go and felt, not satisfaction exactly, something quieter than satisfaction. The particular feeling of a weight that has been carried so long that when it's finally set down, you don't feel lighter immediately. You just feel the absence of the weight, which is its own strange thing. Calloway found her in the corridor afterward. That's about as clean as I've seen one go, he said. What about Devereaux? She said. Different proceeding. He'll be charged. He paused. It'll hold. She nodded. The women, she said. They'll have support through the court's arrangement while they figure out their next steps, he said. It's not perfect, but it's something. It's not enough, she said. It's a start. He looked at her with the expression she'd first seen across the table at Greer's Crossing, the one where the professional neutrality made room for something real underneath. No, he said, it's not enough, but most things worth doing start smaller than they need to be. She thought about that. Her father testified on the second day, which she'd known was happening and had still not been entirely prepared for. Edmund Rowan came into the courtroom looking like a man who had spent several months arriving at something that might eventually, given enough time, become accountability. He was thinner. He was sober, genuinely sober, not just temporarily sober, which she could tell because she knew what both looked like on him. He sat in the witness chair and he answered Calloway's questions about the night Hale had come to the cabin. And he did not minimize or deflect, which she suspected had required more effort than anything else he'd done in years. She watched him from the gallery. She had thought about what she would feel when she saw him, and she had been wrong about most of it. She'd expected anger, and the anger was there. She'd expected grief, and that was there too. What she hadn't expected was the exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of having spent so long being angry at someone who was too broken to be a satisfying target for it. He saw her in the gallery, just briefly, at the end of his testimony, when he was being led back out. He looked at her the way he'd looked at the table that night, not quite able to hold it. She looked back. She didn't look away. She didn't nod or give him anything, but she looked at him as a person, which cost her something, and was maybe the most complicated thing she did in all of those 2 weeks. She did not speak to him. She was not ready for that, and she was done doing things before she was ready. They rode back to the mountain in late May, when the trees were green all the way up the ridge and the creek was running clear from the snowmelt, and the morning smelled like warming earth. The cabin looked different in the late spring light. Less austere, less fortress, more like a place someone actually lived. She'd had something to do with that. The kitchen garden she'd started in March that was beginning to show actual progress. The second chair on the porch she'd made Gideon help her build, even though it was slightly uneven. Thomas came up in June, as promised, and this time he came with more than one change of clothes and a book Eliza had arranged for him through Whitmore, which meant he was planning to stay longer than a visit, which she'd sanctioned and which Gideon hadn't objected to. The three of them fell into something that wasn't quite a family yet, and wasn't quite not one. Too complicated for a word that simple, too specific to this particular set of people in this particular place to fit a category neatly. Gideon taught Thomas the trapline. Eliza taught Thomas the rifle, starting at 40 yards, correcting his shoulder the way Gideon had corrected hers. Thomas was better than her at it faster, which she told him was infuriating and which was also true, and he took this as the compliment it was. On an evening in July, Gideon asked her to marry him. He did not do it well. He was not a man built for the formal version of anything, and he started the sentence twice before he said what he meant, which was essentially, I want us to be permanent, in whatever way that means something to you. She said yes before he'd finished the sentence, partly because she'd been expecting it for a while and had already decided, and partly because she felt like putting him out of the misery of the speech. They were married by the county clerk in Harlan in August. It was not a long ceremony. Thomas was there, and Calloway, who'd come a considerable distance and brought a bottle of decent whiskey, which was appreciated by everyone except Thomas, who was given coffee and told that was the same as far as ceremonies were concerned. In the fall, Cora found her. Eliza had left word through Calloway's office that she was reachable through Whitmore, and Cora had taken several months to find her footing after the Guthrie house before she'd used it. She came up the trail on a rented horse on a September morning, looking better than Eliza had last seen her and not entirely well, which was honest and which matched how healing tended to actually go. In pieces, unevenly, with setbacks. They sat on the porch and talked for a long time. Where are you going? Eliza asked. Ohio, Cora said. I've got a cousin there. She knows some of what happened. She paused. I don't know what I do when I get there. I don't know what I'm good for anymore outside of... She stopped. You're good for a great many things, Eliza said. That place didn't define what you're capable of. It tried to, but that's different from succeeding. Cora looked at her. How do you do that? She said. Believe that. After what... I don't always, Eliza said. But I keep coming back to it. She looked out at the clearing, at the hemlocks, at the mountain rising above. I think that's all it actually requires. Not believing it all the time, just coming back to it. Cora stayed 2 nights. Before she left, she said, "If I ever needed somewhere, if things in Ohio—" "You know where we are," Eliza said. Cora nodded. She rode out through the clearing and down the north trail, and Eliza watched her go and thought about the yellow-lit room on Guthrie Street and the thin porridge and the 4 women around a table who had all been worth so much more than anyone had bothered to tell them. Pearl came through in October, briefly, passing through the county on her way west. Then, in the following spring, a woman Eliza didn't know, someone Calloway had quietly directed, a woman from 2 counties east who'd escaped a situation with no map for what came next. Then another. Then 2 sisters, then a girl barely older than Lucy, then women who arrived not because Calloway sent them, but because word traveled in the channels that word travels in when people are trying to survive things that most of the world doesn't want to look at. They didn't have much to offer. The cabin was what it was, small, cold in winter, accessible only by a trail that required either a horse or a decent pair of legs. But it was off the main road, and it was safe. And Eliza and Gideon were both people who understood what safe actually cost and didn't treat it cheaply. Gideon built 2 more rooms onto the cabin in the 2nd year, which he did because Eliza asked and because he was a man who had his reasons for wanting this place to be useful in ways that went beyond his own survival. He didn't talk about the reasons much. He didn't need to. Thomas turned 13 and then 14 and stayed, largely because there was no better option and increasingly because he'd stopped thinking of it as temporary. He was good with the horses, patient in the way that useful people often are, and he had a quality Eliza recognized as her mother's, the ability to make someone feel like they were worth the effort without performing it. She thought about her mother a lot in those years, not with the ache of the early grief, but with a different kind of feeling. Gratitude, maybe. Complicated gratitude. For what had been passed on in the small and specific ways that parents pass things on without knowing they're doing it. The bird calls. The patience. The willingness to sit with something hard and not look away from it. She thought sometimes about what her life would have looked like if the cabin door had opened differently that October night. If her father had come to her first, the way she'd told him he should have. If they'd figured something out together. If the $30 Gideon spent had gone instead to the land note and bought them another season. She couldn't follow that thread all the way. It disappeared into the dark of what might have been, which was a country she couldn't actually visit. What she had was what had happened and what she'd done with it, and the women who passed through the cabin on the North Ridge and left a little more intact than they'd arrived. That was enough. Some days it was more than enough. Some days it felt insufficient against the scale of what needed fixing, and on those days she did what she'd been doing since she was 12 years old, which was to focus on the problem directly in front of her and trust that the larger problem would still be there tomorrow when she could get to it. One evening in the 3rd year, when the October light was coming down off the ridge in that thin gold way it had, and Thomas was at the barn and the cabin was quiet, Gideon said to her, "Do you think about Hale?" "Sometimes," she said, "less than I expected to." "What do you think when you do?" She considered. "I think about the fact that he looked at me and saw $2, she said, "and I think about everything that came from that. All of it, the bad and the other." She looked at the mountain. "He thought he was taking something from me. He didn't know he was setting something in motion." Gideon was quiet for a moment. "He didn't know you," he said. "No," she said. "He didn't." The fire was burning in the hearth behind them, the same hearth she'd rebuilt on the night of the attack, the same stones. The second chair on the porch was still slightly uneven. The kitchen garden had gone better this year than last. The mountain was doing what mountains do, which is outlast everything. She was 21 years old. She had been sold for $2 and had turned that into a life she had chosen, which was not a small thing. She knew it was not a small thing, and she held on to that knowledge on the days when it tried to feel smaller than it was. She was not healed of everything. Some things don't heal. They scar over, and the scar is part of you, and you learn to live with it built into your structure. She still moved with the hitch in her left leg. She still sometimes woke at the sound of the tin cans in the wind. She still felt, on certain days, a particular cold fury at the architecture of a world that treated some people as purchasable and other people as customers. And she had stopped expecting that fury to go away and started using it as fuel instead, because fuel was what it was. The frightened girl sold for $2 had not disappeared. She was still in there, still 18 and cold and carrying her cloth bag out of a locked room. Eliza carried her forward, not past. That was the thing nobody told you about surviving something. You don't leave it behind, you bring it with you. And eventually, if you're fortunate and stubborn and surrounded by people who chose you as deliberately as you chose them, you bring it somewhere worth bringing it to. The October wind moved through the hemlocks. The mountain held its ground, the way it always had, the way it would long after everyone in this story was gone. And on the porch of a cabin on the North Ridge, a woman sat in a slightly uneven chair she'd helped build with her own hands, and looked at the valley below. And the valley was ordinary and vast and full of lives she couldn't see, and she was exactly where she had chosen to be.
For real. And I fucking died immediately. I'm pissed. Chandler's gone full mute, bro.
To hurt his feelings.
That cannot be the reason why he stopped talking.
You did save my life twice. When I went back and I was at the door, why was there 7 birds?
I saw that.
Is that thing on the ground where they like group up? Is that a thing?
I have no,
Is that
no,
like their
I don't
nest?
think so.
What
It
even is that,
is like a
spike
nest
thing?
mechanic.
Maybe it is.
No.
'Cause I've never seen that like spike thing. I didn't know what that was. Oh, somebody's playing the jingle game.
I was just trying to get it open. See how much we make from those. Probably not enough. What is quota 330 right now? Oh, we're actually pretty close.
So we need a little less than 100.
I'm gonna sell enough to get us to Rend. Because we need to go to Rend. And maybe get a gun? That'd be nice. A gun for base bitch would be good. Which one do we have? So we need like a lot more. Okay.
Oh, so is there actually other suits in the game now, or?
Oh yeah, there's been suits in the game. They're just expensive.
Then what is he doing?
Scrolling.
Go rolling.
Scrolling, 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 scrolling.
Oh, where did Chandler go?
I don't know.
I'm right here.
Why are you muted?
I forgot I was on push to talk.
How long have y'all been Leithland? I don't know. Can't say. How much money do we have? We gotta sell like 2 more items and we're good. I'll sell.
Going around.
Yeah, we're going around. Keep all of our bolts, I guess. The bolt drawer. We should probably sell. How much is this? We need a little more so we can buy walkies. We've been playing for at least an hour or 2.
Yeah, since I joined, it's been 3 hours, and I don't know how long you guys were playing before that.
Alrighty then.